the dialogue right now, to hear over and over the statement that people should be fortunate to come to the U.S. And that's something that I am really interested in talking about today. This notion that people are somehow taking that they're extracting resources by studying in the U.S. And it's actually very much the other way around. These are students who are contributing far more to a university than they take.
Hello, and welcome to the Fiction Nonfiction podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, the author of the novel Brotherless Night.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
So Whit, I'm curious if you know how many international students UMKC has, and if you have any in your classes. What's that presence like there?
I know that we have a sizable international student population. I did not know how many people exactly we had, but you've looked it up for me, and I'm going to read the numbers that you sent, which is that in 2022 we had 17,000 plus students in F and J immigration statuses.
Wait! You really don't know because it's 1,700.
No, 1,700, right? Okay, that would make our university 3 times its normal size. About 15% of the student body is from outside the United States, and more than 85 countries are represented among the student body. And for me, it's been a really this is something that's changed over recent years. And in the interview, as you'll hear, we talk about that some. But I love the presence of international students in the UMKC community.
And the places that they mostly come from the top countries are represented are India, China, South Korea, Brazil. I was surprised by that, and Pakistan. And I have a number of international students in both my graduate and undergraduate classes, and I've had that at every place I've taught, and it has always been really important to me. Looking up these numbers was actually fascinating because, and really thinking about, what percentage of the student body is actually international. I don't think I really knew before looking it up, and you clearly didn't.
It's a lot of people, however, who are going to be vulnerable to the Trump administration's targeting of international students, which we've talked about in our last episode with Megan O'Rourke. Last month, Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced that the State Department is revoking some international student visas, including F1 and J1 visas. They focused on people with criminal records and have also set about developing a list of countries whose citizens may face suspension of new visas and revocation of existing visas. And some of these students have had their visas revoked without notification and have subsequently been abducted by ICE.
That might even be the most common scenario, that a student doesn't know their visa status has changed. So universities are trying to get on top of this right now. It's not exactly a calm time in academia, and this is one of the most pressing issues. And, many people in my family have been international students. Some of the people I'm closest to, both in the US and in other countries. And I think that among the many options available of things that are making me angry right now, this is one of the things that's making me angriest. It's not even really close. And it's also true that some of my favorite books are about the complex lives international scholars lead. So one example that I'm thinking of by a former guest on this show as well, Abdul Razak Gurna's Gravel Heart. And thinking about the kind of rich perspectives that international students bring to my life, I'm very pissed off about this.
I wouldn't be able to. The Good Lieutenant has Iraqi characters in it, and I met a crucial source for the novel walking home to my house, which is very near the campus, and just seeing a guy. I'd seen him multiple times at a house where Muslim men were praying, and I introduced myself, and he turned out to be Iraqi from exactly the space that I was writing about, and he was very helpful in the writing of my book. So today we're going to talk about the international students in the news and in literature, and to do that we're joined by Sheila Sundar. Sheila is a professor of English and creative writing at the University of Mississippi. Her writing has appeared in the Virginia Quarterly Review, the Massachusetts Review, the Three Penny Review, and elsewhere. She lives in New Orleans with her husband and their 3 children. The protagonist of Habitations, her acclaimed debut novel, is an international scholar working in the U.S. Sheila, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Sheila, we're so happy to have you here. And you are, like Whitney and I think you're teaching this term, right?
I am. Yes. I'm a professor at the University of Mississippi. Yeah.
And what is the environment for international students at Mississippi right now? How many international students are there?
We're a very small, international students are a very small percentage of the student body, about 3.5%. So under 700 students total. somewhat split, a little bit in favor of our graduate students. We have a slightly large number of international graduate students, and the climate is it is very eerie quiet. On the surface, it seems as though nothing is happening. On the surface, you wouldn't know who won the election. The political outcome is not necessarily visible on our student campus. Um, or the political outcome is not necessarily visible among our students on campus. Um, but there is a simmering anxiety, and it's happening at a quieter level, which I think is, feels a little bit sinister when you're working at a university, that you receive emails about the concerns and the kind of cautionary language being directed towards international students. So advice not to go home because re-entering is going to be complicated. And it seems like a sort of it comes to you via, like, in the same way that other administrative emails do. But the message is just to not be able to go home because you might not be able to enter a country to which you have been granted a visa to study is so sinister. Um, and there's a lot of fear. Of course, there's a lot of fear. Then there are people who want to go home. They're students. They want to see their families. Um, we also consider this at the admissions level. It doesn't affect, of course, who we admit, but I'm on the admissions committee of our MFA program. And so we sort through hundreds of, like every MFA program in the country, we sort through hundreds of fiction applicants and poetry applicants. And many of those who rise to the top are international students. And we are aware that to admit a student, it will never ever affect who we admit by any means. We admit the fiction writers who we believe are the best fit for our program. But it does mean that we might be offering an opportunity that might not be in the best interest of a person. It might not be in the best interest of a person to come to the United States to study right now. And we have to take that into account. They're young people who are trying to start their creative and academic lives. And we are offering them a position that might be something that puts their safety in jeopardy. And these are students who could study anywhere in the world. So why come to the U.S. in this moment? So I think that one of the things that is so evident right now is that when you walk through campus, there is a quiet to it. Nobody's talking about this publicly, but these anxieties are getting to people. That these are the quiet conversations that international students are having among themselves. And so there's a sense that it's actually a very lonely struggle. We are not an overtly political campus, and which is something that I'm eager to talk about as well. The climate of something like this on a campus where students are not part of a culture of sort of taking to the streets, and so it is just there's a quiet anxiety.
I was just thinking about during the President Trump's first term here at UMKC. I teach the University of Missouri, Kansas
Hmm.
City. We had a student from India who was shot and killed in a robbery that
Yeah.
had some racial overtones. And that was during the Muslim ban period.
Hmm.
Um, and it feels reminiscent of that, except worse, right? I mean, surely the students that are, and the families who are thinking about sending these students to school are reading stories, right, about what's happening in the United States. Do you have any private conversations with students about that?
Um, when students arrive on campus, which is, I think, part of the maddening part of this moment, is that students arrive on campus to be students. So when I do meet with my international students, it's to talk about their writing. And which is not to say they're not having these conversations, but the time that they have to interface with their professors is time when they really want to talk about the work that motivated them to pick up their lives and move across the world. And so I cannot believe this is something that we actually have I cannot believe in general any moment where people have to actually declare their dignity to a world that challenges it. It is a shock. But these are what international students, when they set foot on campus, they're there as students. And so I don't doubt that these conversations are happening. They have to for people's survival, for their emotional well-being. But when they meet with us, with me at least, they want to talk about the arc of their characters, the development of their dissertation, their excitement over publication, their submissions, and they're coming here to study, and that's what we're taking from them. So so no, I haven't. But on the other end, um, I just I think that these conversations around the level of violence in America have long been part of the international student conversation, and the dialogue right now, to hear over and over the statement that people should be fortunate to come to the U.S. And that's something that I am really interested in talking about today. This notion that people are somehow taking that they're extracting resources by studying in the U.S. and it's actually very much the other way around. These are students who are contributing far more to a university than they take in ways that are both measurable in terms of student research and scholarship and creative work, but also immeasurable. Um, but I'll pause there and I say I'm eager to get back to that point. But I do know from the international students that I have, or the family members that I've spoken to in India prior to their, or as they sort of work through their decision of whether or not to come to the States, the looming threat of American gun violence is always part of the conversation. Where can I go to be safest? Is it true that there are more guns than people in the US? Is it true that there's racial violence? Is it true that I'll be unsafe? And we've never really been able to say that we never been able as Americans to offer much assurance on that, but certainly in this moment we can offer no assurance on those questions.
Sort of to I think your point about who's extracting what from whom is really well taken. And I think you're also talking about like a sort of broad chilling of speech, which I mean, relatively recently, I've been traveling a bunch and I had a conference and also doing some stuff online. And I had a conversation with a student, an international student recently, where they asked me a question and I responded with a particular piece of editorial advice. And then they told me they would not feel safe taking the editorial advice I had given in the current environment. And I was like, okay, I mean, I can't really argue. Like, if it's about how you feel putting words on the page, and how you feel depicting things, I certainly can't responsibly steer you in another direction at this moment. You have to feel safe doing what you're doing. And I also was sort of like, I hope that in your classroom you'll feel safe doing this. I hope that you feel safe writing the story that you want to write. But I mean, it was like a pretty horrifying moment for me when all those things came together. And it was the first time I'd had such a conversation. I really, really freaking hope it's the last.
That is chilling.
It was not a great moment. And I mean, as you say, like so much of the life of being an international student is lonely. And part of the reason it has been lonely, from what I understand from my friends who have, been international scholars, is that the mechanisms of US bureaucracy, both government and academic, separate international students in such a way, like cause them to face an apparatus that is so labyrinthine and discriminatory, right? You have students maybe who were educated in English taking TOEFLs. You have, questioning of ability to instruct, again, when there are students who are prepared to study in English. There's just sort of like a lot of administrative and financial hurdles, like the fact that you can't, right, work restrictions on you are different,
Yes.
so that your
Yes.
financial life is different. And so that bureaucracy has always been there. And now it is being weaponized in a way that I'm not sure is totally clear. I mean, I certainly the videos of people being abducted are totally clear, but there are other things that are like, it's for people outside that apparatus. I think it's not always clear. And one of the things that your book does is depict that some of that bureaucracy in really, really human terms. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the bureaucracy that international students deal with and read a passage from the book for us.
Sure. I think that the point that you made about work restrictions is something that we know it on a theoretical level. These are the parameters of the visa. This is what the visa offers. This is what the visa prohibits. But to not work as an international student assumes so much about what a person needs to survive. And when I work at a university right now where the cost of living is exorbitant, and it's largely driven by but by Southern nostalgia, by football culture, and by the presence of sort of Airbnbs and people who rent their homes or their apartments for football weekends, and then which is a huge industry. I mean, if anybody who's ever lived or worked in an SEC town, it drives the culture. And so you have a market where in general, graduate students are struggling to make it for their years on campus, and to add to that, inability to work creates a. I mean, I've spoken. What one conversation I have had with international students is, if I can't work, I don't know if I can finish my degree here. And so that that policy is so restrictive, and it creates a stress that is just incompatible with the demands of scholarship. I mean, these have to be years where you're devoting yourself wholly to your academic pursuits, and that's being taken from people. So, and then the point that you made also about the labyrinthine process, but that knowing that your legal presence in a country is fully tied to your status as a student, so that the clock stops the moment you are no longer enrolled. And when we think about the sort of humanity in, or the elements of our education that have given it humanity and connection and connectivity, there is a sort of there's an entitlement to our presence on campuses when you're not an international student. You could linger for a while. You can take a little bit of time off if you need to. You can take a job to allow you to sustain yourself. You can work longer hours one semester, and then another, when you're taking more classes, you can pull back. And so that the restriction on just sort of the mechanisms that allow people to survive is something that we are okay with, because we've never gotten out from under the notion that immigrants are takers, and that we have to punish the immigrant experience just enough to let people know that they're not in the US on equal footing. There is nothing to be gained by limiting the capacity of international students to work. There is nothing to be gained by cutting off by cutting off their legal ability to be in a country the moment that their academic lives. There's nothing to be gained from restricting. There's nothing to be gained by the administration of TOEFL exams. There is just, we are consistently we are so intent on this reminder that your status in the country is precarious, and if it's not precarious, then we don't trust that you will somehow not take advantage of the extraordinary generosity of the US, or you might you might for a moment think that you are on equal footing with those around you who are US born. And it is something that I think in this horrible moment we need to rethink this at every level. That the rounding up of international students is so terrifying. It's so vile. It should chill us all. But should also remind us that these small and sinister policies have long been hampering the freedom of international students, and it's to a much lesser degree, but they are something that this moment should call into question.
Okay, I just want to clarify one thing that I mentioned in the beginning. The case that I was talking about here at UMKC happened in Olathe, Kansas, which is a nearby small town. There were two men who were involved. The UMKC student who was shot survived. There was another man who was killed, but just to make sure that that happened in 2017. Um, One of the other things that we've been talking about here is, like, not only is it maybe right now difficult to be here, it's difficult to get here as an international student. There's an incredible number of bureaucratic barriers. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that and then read us a passage of the book that deals with that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on the bureaucratic barriers that international students face. I should say. But what I'm well, like, I'll read the passage, and I'll happily return to the question. So I'm going to read a passage from somewhat early in the novel. Again, this is a story of a sociologist who moves to the United States in pursuit of her academic goals, and then ultimately is able to stay. And so it's an immigrant novel that begins in the corridors of academia and then moves through the world of the broader process of building a home in a new country. In the section that I'm about to read, Vega, my protagonist, a sociologist who moves from India to the United States, is about to receive her visa, or about to stand in line at the consulate to receive her visa, and it references the illness and subsequent death of her younger sister years prior, which is something that Vega carries with her throughout the novel. Vega had been to the American consulate years earlier with her parents and Ashwini, just before their move to Cleveland, but it hadn't registered to her as a significant event. They had been given a special early morning appointment, and their visas were granted swiftly. But she later pieced together that it was the urgency of Ashwini's medical condition that made this possible. Now the consulate was swarming with people. The man in line before her was patting his neck with a handkerchief and muttering to himself. When she stepped closer, she could hear that it was a rehearsal of the interview ahead. My name is Sendil Kumar. I am studying for master's. I have been granted admission in Nebraska. Just before she entered the building, the man bent over and rested his head against the doorway. Vega had an irrational hope that the door would close just before she could step inside. Instead, she walked behind him and stood at the tape line in front of the window. The officer, an American woman a few years older than Vega, pulled out the contents of the man's envelope without looking up. There's a spelling discrepancy in your name, she said. It's a typical thing, madam. Problem with alphabets only. Names, they are sometimes spelled 2 different manners. 3 different manners sometimes. Don't tell me what's typical. Madam, you need a new VFS appointment letter. Make sure they spell your name just like it is on your birth certificate. That will take weeks, madam. Then I'll see you in weeks. She looked up before the man could walk away. Next. It seemed cruel to step forward, but Vega did anyway, holding her gaze as the officer scanned her admissions letter. After a long silence, she assumed that her application had been rejected. She felt relieved. She'd returned to the tight but familiar walls of her parents' house. But after a few minutes, the officer stamped the form and said, "You can arrive 1 week prior to the program, but the visa ends on the final day. 1 more day, and you're in violation." Though Vega was vaguely aware of this policy, the word violation was startling. "I don't intend to stay longer," she'd said, but the woman was already looking past her, nodding to the next applicant.
Thank you so much. So I think that it's a great depiction, and there's several other moments where there's a lot of like the real emotional consequences of visas in the novel, which I should say I think is just a spectacularly good novel. And like, so this is this depiction of the bureaucracy we were just talking about. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on now that's so different than what international?
When you were writing this was obviously before the new Trump administration's policies. But did you have some sense that this was going to turn out this way?
No, I mean, Suki, I think you had just spoken about this, or we've had this conversation, or I have some sense that this is part of your story as well. But growing up, I had so many cousins come to the United States to study, and as undergrads and graduate students. And because I grew up in the Northeast, close to where many of them were studying, my home ended up being kind of a hub for so many of these students. I mean, they would come for Thanksgiving, they would come for holidays, they'd come over the summer, they'd watch us when we were small. And so I always had this idea, even though I would listen in on conversations more and more as I got older about the concerns and the anxieties facing families when they made their decisions to send their students, their children abroad. I grew up with an idea that to be an international student was just a rich experience. And it was rich for those people coming abroad to study, but it was also a rich experience in terms of what they gave to the university, because they would talk so often, and these were never political conversations. I think what's so wrenching about this moment is it takes experiences that are actually fundamentally apolitical, the acquisition of knowledge, the building of relationships, the broadening of one's horizons, the kind of exchange of cultural and intellectual knowledge, and these fundamentally human experiences, um, and it hampers them, and it treats them as though they somehow pose a threat, or they're these bizarre transactions, and these kind of sinister transactions. But what I saw growing up was this constant stream of people who were coming to the U.S. and enjoying the hell out of it. Not necessarily because the U.S. offered the sort of bounty that their home country didn't, but because traveling is a wildly exciting experience. And so I always knew that there was something for Vega to be gained by going abroad. and there was something that the people around her would benefit from in her presence in the US. And this wasn't even a political decision. I mean, I think when we write political fiction, we quickly shed this notion that we are going to be able to change people's minds or assert our own politics on the page. What we end up doing is crafting human stories that follow the sort of contours and complexities of human experience. And the experience that I wanted Vega to have was one of sorting through the politics and the culture and the economy and the romance and the sex and the everything of being in the United States. And what she was pushing past was were just layers and layers of red tape to get to the substance of the life that she wanted to have. Um, when I so there's it almost feels quaint to remember this conversation because in broad diversity conversations back when we kind of accepted that to diversify student bodies and workplaces was a good thing, and when that when was an emerging notion when this idea kind of emerged in mainstream politics that diversity was good. um there was a debate that again right now feels very quaint about whether or not we should frame diversity as an initiative that was designed to benefit the broader student body. Do we consider the benefit of diversity because, for example, a student like the University of as a campus like the University of Mississippi, where it's a flagship state university, the majority of students come from in-state, about a little over 50%. Those who are not a measurable percentage of those who are not in state are from the South. Mississippi is a state among it ranks, I think, second in terms of passport holders in the United States, which is not an indictment of the university or the campus or the culture, but it is a reflection of the way the world in which the university operates and the world from which so many of our students come, which is one where you are not necessarily given the opportunity to travel abroad, where that's not something those people around you are doing, where you haven't grown up necessarily with members of your community from a wide range of other cultural backgrounds. And so we prior to this moment in history where this assault on diversity has been so direct, the there has long been a conversation about whether or not the presence of international students, students of color, will benefit historically white institutions. And I obviously teach at a historically white institution, a predominantly white institution. And the University of Mississippi is like when you think PWI, like this is the last time the students really took to the street en masse was at the time of the school's integration when James Meredith enrolled at the law school the university. And so when you think about the impact of international students, that is for so many of our undergrads, that is their first exposure to somebody who's not from the US. That is their first meaningful exposure to somebody who's not from the South, sometimes from the American South. That is not an indictment of those students. We are all from the homes and communities that we are from. We don't choose them. But when we go to go to a university, one of the promises that a university makes is I'm going to expose you to something beyond the borders of your town. And we have a number of students who transfer from community colleges who claw their way from small towns to two-year colleges to a four-year flagship institution. And what we owe those students are all the benefits of being at a university. One of those benefits is access to the wider world. And so when I think about the assault on students, the primary assault is on the bodies and identities and dignities and possibilities of these students who are coming from abroad. But a secondary threat is to students who are coming to the university with an expectation that it's going to do something for them, something that they can't necessarily identify when they're 18, 19, 20. But they come to the university with a certain sense that there is something there for them that was not offered that would not have been offered had they stayed home, um, had they not taken this leap too? I mean, it is a leap to go to college. And when we are taking when we are trying to kind of this particular political moment has such consequence for students for whom this was their window into the wider world too. And again, this I hate this conversation because it brings us back to a moment when we were sort of a very, very early moment of pushing for diversity initiatives, when we could only really see them in terms of how they benefited white students. But the fact is, diversity initiatives and the presence of international students profoundly alter the course of life for white students in predominantly white campuses, especially in places like Mississippi, where students come to college without having had the access to the wider world that students at other parts of the country might have. And it's sort of weird language, and I would love the chance to rephrase that because I realize I'm kind of working through that question. I don't want to generalize students in Mississippi either, but my own background, I grew up in New Jersey, which is the state with some of the highest passport holders in the country, which is largely because of the percentage of immigrants in that state. University of Mississippi as a state has a growing number of undocumented people, and many of whom work in the poultry industry, work in agriculture, and the children of those of those families their presence on campus is just increasing. It takes a little bit of time to realize that the flagship state university belongs to you as well, and so we have a growing percentage of Latinx students on campus, and many of whom come from families who came to work in agriculture. And but the vast and of course the presence of African American students in Mississippi is growing slightly, but Black students are very much underrepresented on campus compared to the numbers in the state. Um, so much of what international student presence it offers on a campus like University of Mississippi is a way for students to see the wider world in a way that they might not if they stayed at home. And I just want to recognize in this conversation that international students do not come to extract resources. And this language that we are hearing from Marco Rubio, from Trump, this idea that if you come to the US, you should do it with incredible gratitude, is such a false and narrow notion of what international students do when they study abroad, when they come to the US to study.
So as you were talking, one of the things that your book depicts is a kind of elliptical travel where Vega like grows up partly in the US and then goes back to India and then comes back as a student and then goes back again and then comes back again. And so there's a freedom of movement there that students now are experiencing being taken away from that. And of course, as we have all seen on these horrifying videos, students are being abducted, right? They're encountering ICE. And I think the two most prominent examples are probably Ramiza Ozturk and Mahmoud Khalil, who were abducted by ICE in Somerville, Massachusetts, a Tufts student, a Tufts graduate student abducted in Somerville, Massachusetts. And Mahmoud Khalil was a Columbia leader of the pro-Palestine protests. Ramiza Ozturk had authored and co-authored an op-ed about Palestine and kind of our moral obligations in this moment. And now both of these students are in detention. Mahmoud Khalil, we're taping this on Sunday, April 6th. Yesterday online, Mahmoud Khalil had dictated an op-ed for the Columbia Spectator to his attorney from ICE, from detention with ICE. So you can read that op-ed and we'll link to it in our show notes. I mean, as you say, we want as professors to be talking to our students about their work. And I will say that right now, one of the major questions I am discussing with colleagues, not just here, but also elsewhere, is what we as professors should be doing to support students who are seeing these videos and thinking, I could be the next person to experience this. What is it that we should be doing to support our students who are worried about the possibility of their own situations changing? And what should university administrations be doing? Because there's a huge range on that. And I'm seeing sort of, some schools where there's almost no communication at all, and a select few that are doing a great job of making clear to their students what is happening and what they can do to be as safe as possible.
Yeah. I mean, the complexity, of course, of the question is that we cannot offer false assurances to our students, and it's murky, it's uncertain, it's evolving, and so we're cautious in our advice. So I'll cut it. I'll start that over. That what we all want to see, I believe our administration's doing, is loudly taking to the streets. And that means that we want to see not a single university capitulating. We want to see not a single university giving in. We want to see every single university state their opposition to the assault on academic freedom, on international students. on the safety of undocumented students. Um, and the sensitivity that we experience as academics is that to advocate for students is multi-pronged. We have to let them know that we are in their corner. We have to also be transparent with them about the threats that loom and the ones that are well beyond our control. And we also have to act in a way that doesn't compromise our jobs because we have to be there for them. And so it's one of those, every single academic I believe, who is having this conversation about how to take a stand is weighing their desire to be bold and outspoken with their anxieties around their jobs. And that second part of that sounds so self-centered, but we are there for our students. None of us wants to be replaced with somebody who is unsympathetic with the plight of international students. And because that is the ideal, right? That every single person who is out of step, out of line with this administration's ideals will be replaced by a loyalist. And in general, we want to stay where we are because we have to protect the kind of front lines of what a university does, which is interface with students, nurture their scholarship, support them creatively, support them in their creativity, their research, etc. And if we are gone, we are unable to do that. And so for those of us who are not tenure track, for those of us who are untenured, that precarity, I think, is even more present in our minds. Um, and so what I want our universities to do is to protect us. What I want our administrations to do is to protect our students. And I want to I want to operate in a climate where if we take to the streets, that our jobs will still be protected. And that could only happen if our universities rise to the occasion. It was shocking to see Highlights magazine take a stand against what is happening. And Columbia can't do it, and Harvard can't do it. And so we have because the student the Tufts graduate student was a contributor to Highlights and had done beautiful
Was she?
research on yes,
I
done
did not know
beautiful
that.
Okay.
research on
I didn't know that either.
if I'm wrong, cut this please. I'm taking some liberties here, but this was shared with me through a friend who works in children's literature, and she had studied the theme of death in children's literature. I mean, find me a worthier topic than that, how children's literature grapples with death. And I think that we have to remember this, that people come to the US to study a rich and wide tapestry of subjects. And in doing so, they are contributing to a rich wide tapestry of fields. That was her work. Highlights magazine to take a stand, and we can't rely on our university administrations to take a stand. I want us to be protected too, so that we can do what we need to do to continue to nurture and protect our students.
So just to be specific here, Tufts University actually, unusually among universities that have been facing this issue, Tufts University issued a statement
Yes.
in support of this graduate student. And it's a pretty good example of something that a university could do that is seemingly simple that schools are not doing. And the statement says things like, this student was in good standing with us. We know her to be a good person. We have no evidence that she has committed any crime or has violated the terms of her visa in any way. And other schools are not doing this. And it's actually really simple. So when we say stand up for students, what does that mean? It means like contacting a student saying, are you okay? But it also, like in very practical terms, means saying things like, some of these students, right? Students don't have legal counsel. They don't necessarily have money for that. These schools should be providing legal counsel for students. That also does not seem to be automatically happening. And then there's a fine distinction here between visa status and enrollment status. So if a student does have to leave, or if it is the safest route for them to leave, right? So what's happening here is that the Trump administration is manually revoking visas. Marco Rubio was manually doing this, and they're doing this without notification. So at many schools, the way that students are finding out is either when they encounter ICE, or if they're lucky, they're getting some sort of notification, maybe from an international students office that is checking their visa status, which they have the capacity to do. So those offices are now getting taxed in a way they weren't before because they're checking. They're trying to find out if a student's status is changed. It of course helps the student to know in advance. it's great to not be surprised, as you can see in that video of Rumsa Turk, where she encounters ICE and she's like, but, you know, like, get away from me. I want to call the police. And they say, I am the police. And she's completely surprised. So one thing I think to do is to help students to gather the information. And then there's also keeping them enrolled, right? Even if visa status changes, enrollment status does not, to the best of my understanding, does not also have to change. So how can you also protect a student's path to degree? Right, some of these students, like, it's almost the end of the academic year. You're watching students who are on the verge of completing their educations. So what can we do to protect their ability to complete their educations, which is like why they came here in the first place? And that's the promise that we made. And some of this is like, you know, Harvard just hired, they just increased the size of their international student office by like 20% to deal with this. So like a simple thing that our schools could be doing, be freaking hiring people to support these students, because the people working in those offices are getting absolutely slammed.
I also think we should be clear, like what the administration is doing, just to be clear, like the $400 million in research grants that were threatened to be pulled from Columbia, and it seems like maybe they won't be, but they were, the administration said they were doing that because of the way the university handled protests against Israel's military campaign in Gaza. So there's a connection there, right? That the administration is saying, hey, if you don't toe the line on what we want to do in terms of politics, we're going to take this funding away. And the international students are getting mixed up in the middle of that, right? Particularly students who have been speaking out about that particular issue. But so the universities are scared about money, which universities are always scared about. But I want to make a point, which is I wrote a piece like that I never ended up publishing because the terms of the travel ban were changed in 2017. But I did do some research and I looked this up. Um, in 2016, 2017, the University of Missouri Kansas City estimates that the international students at our school would spend $13.5 million in tuition and fees to our university and would inject over $22 million into the regional economy. So not only is there like learning exchange, right? But at UMKC, there's a real financial reason why the students are here. They're important financially to the university. And so I just want to make sure that that point is clear. Before we run out of time, we want to pivot to talk about your books and what it means to be an international scholar and live a somewhat itinerant life. For starters, as you mentioned, you grew up in New Jersey. When did you start thinking about writing about the lives of international students?
I was always interested in the experience of again, I saw so many students move through my home, my childhood, who were pursuing who were very like excitedly pursuing the exchange of information that comes from being an international student. I had two cousins who went to Mount Holyoke when I was a kid, and they would come home to to our houses on long weekends, and they would talk about the performances they had attended and the friendships they had and the rallies they had gone to and the classes they were taking. They would leave me their books, and they would leave me their their political banners. They would leave me like there was my home felt enriched by students who would come to the US to study. And I felt like I was pulling from the universities and colleges that they attended, and I was pulling from the stories that they told me from growing up in Chennai, or Bangalore, the range of South Indian cities that they came from. My family's from South India. And so their stories were always in my mind. And when I started writing Vega's story, I was really interested in the way in which a sociologist or anybody who is a social critic and is schooled in the work in the social sciences carries that sense of home to another country. So how do you move from being a critic of your home country to being a critic of the social order in another country? And I think what's really interesting now about thinking about those questions is that we're also living in a moment where to be critical of the social order is considered unpatriotic. I mean, this has obviously been a recurring recurring argument throughout history. There's always been a presence in the U.S. that's wanted us to consider the sort of critique of social structure as a threat to the social structure. But I was really interested in writing the story of somebody who had studied caste and gender critically bringing that to the U.S. and understanding how it affected the way in which she looked at race and class and gender dynamics in the United States, how that made her both an outsider, because she had not lived she had not lived as an adult and as an academic in the United States, but also that made her somebody who was uniquely positioned to understand the way in which society worked. And she was an avid reader. She was just a really, really engaged scholar, and somebody who really cared on a very human and intimate level about the way in which people move through and access the promises of their society. And so I really wanted to write about somebody whose intellectual life was rich, and whose interest in the world was a very critical one. I'd grown up on a lot of immigrant literature that I stood on the shoulders of a lot of those immigrant novels, where the immigrant women were kind of pushed to another country by the choices by the choices of men in their lives, or by the circumstances, that forced them to settle in the US or settle in the UK. I really wanted to write somebody who immigrated by choice and who wanted a seat at the table. And so in moving through Vega's story, and moving through drafts and drafts, I mean, the final product of a novel is something where we are pushing our characters closer and closer to kind of becoming human with each draft sometimes. And so as Vega became more and more human with each draft, she became sharper, she became wittier, she became more confident. And in what I wanted to get to was a novel where an immigrant character had something to say and believed firmly that she had the right to speak up. And so when I hear, Sugi, when I hear your story about a student critiquing their work, or looking at it through looking at it as something that will ultimately be scrutinized for its sort of political cleanliness, it's terrifying. I mean, it should terrify all of us. It should terrify all of us across the political spectrum. But it is, so much of the work that we do in revision is kind of learning how to uncensor our characters, how to get them to speak up a little bit, and how to get them to be a little bit more human, a little bit more vocal. And as I wrote Vega, I was aware that I wanted to leave behind a novel in which an immigrant character was sharp and unafraid, and was bold in her thinking, and bold in her speech. So I'll
I
pause
think you
there.
succeeded. I think you
Oh,
succeeded.
thank you. Plugging in. Thank you.
Sheila, thanks for joining us. Listeners, you can find her gorgeous novel, Habitations, at an independent bookstore near you.
Thank you both so much for having me. This was such a pleasure.
Thanks for being with us.